Hello. Have you ever thought about how a really famous story can connect to a real important time in history? Well, today we're going to look at a perfect example, the famous book Gone with the Wind, and a real war, the American Civil War. So, this is the big question for us today. How does a made-up story, a work of fiction, get so tied together with a real event that changed a country? Let's dive in and see how a story and history can meet. But first things first. Before we can really get the story, we need to understand the real history behind it. So let's start with a quick look at the American Civil War. So what is a civil war? Well, the idea is simple, but it's also very sad. It just means a war where people from the same country are fighting against each other. In America, the war was between two parts of the country, the North and the South. And they were very different. You see, the North had a lot of factories and cities, and most people there were against slavery. But the South was different. Its economy was all about huge farms, and they used enslaved people to do all the work. This huge disagreement is what led to the war. The North fought to keep the country together as one, but the South wanted to leave and form its own country. So, when did all of this happen? Well, it all started back in 1861, right after Abraham Lincoln became president. The war lasted for 4 very long and difficult years, and it finally ended in 1865. And this was a truly terrible war. Just look at this number. Over 600,000 soldiers died. That's more American soldiers than in almost all of their other wars combined. It was a huge, huge loss of life. So, how did it all end? Well, the result changed America forever. The North won the war. And that meant 2 really big things happened. First, the United States stayed as one country. And second, slavery was finally ended. Okay, so now that we have that history in our minds, let's switch over to our story. It's time to talk about the very famous book, Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is a super famous book that came out way back in 1936. It's all about this woman, Scarlett O'Hara, who is living in the American South right when all of this is happening. Now, Scarlett's family lives on something called a plantation. And to really get the story, we need to understand this word. A plantation was a really, really big farm. The families who owned them were usually very rich, and all the hard work growing things like cotton, that was done by enslaved people. So the book actually starts in a pretty peaceful time, right before the war begins. We see Scarlett's life. It's all about parties and nice dresses, but then the war comes, and everything changes. The story follows Scarlett as she has to fight just to survive and save her home, as her whole world gets turned upside down. Okay, now we get to the really interesting part. Let's connect the dots. Let's see exactly how the real things that happened in the Civil War actually shape the story of Scarlett O'Hara. First, a real fact from history. The Civil War was just devastating for the South. So many homes, farms, and cities were completely destroyed. Life became incredibly hard. And we see this exact thing happen in the book. Scarlett's beautiful home, her plantation called Tara, is almost destroyed by the war, and her fight to save it becomes a big, powerful symbol for what the entire South was going through. Okay, here's another real thing that happened. Near the end of the war, the city of Atlanta, a very important city in the South, was captured by the Northern Army and burned. This was a real, terrible event. So how does this show up in the story? Well, in one of the most famous scenes in the book and the movie, Scarlett has to escape from Atlanta while the whole city is burning around her. The story uses this real event to create this incredible moment of danger and drama. So the story uses real history, right? And this is super important, a story is not the same thing as a history lesson. Let's talk about why that is. You see, Gone with the Wind tells the story from just one side. It shows how people in the South felt about the war and what they went through. This is called a point of view, and it means we aren't getting the whole picture. So what does this Southern point of view look like? Well, the book often shows the South before the war as this beautiful, almost magical place. It can make the reason the South fought seem good and noble, but it leaves out the really hard and awful truth of slavery, which was what that whole way of life was built on. This kind of romantic way of remembering the Old South is sometimes called a myth. Now, a myth isn't just a story that's false. It's a really powerful story that lots of people believe, and it can actually change how people think about their own history. So, after all this, why are we still talking about this old book? Why does this connection between a story and a real war still matter so much today? Well, the reason is that this story was just so powerful. For millions and millions of people all over the world, the book and the movie, they didn't just tell a story about the war. For them, it became the history of the war. It shaped everything they thought they knew about that time. So I'll leave you with this last question to think about. How do the stories we love, the books we read, the movies we watch, how do they change how we see the past? It's a good reminder that stories are powerful. They don't just entertain us, they can actually shape how we see the world. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.